All right. So, I mean, I guess we just got a look at these models. I'm
Yeah.
sure that you were watching along. What jumped out to you?
What jumped out to me was no epi curve was presented. So I was expecting something resembling what the Americans had, like their IHME curves that the Gates Foundation had funded, showing when the cases would peak and when we anticipate them to be diminishing. That was not given. Instead, we got anticipated ICU saturation dates, which is useful, and we can probably extrapolate from that something resembling an epi curve. But I was expecting some semblance of what they expected in terms of the rate of new cases to be. What also jumped out at me was the estimate for the scenario that would have happened if we had done nothing. And it strikes me that that was a quick back of the envelope calculation. They took the population of Ontario, 50 million, multiplied by the expected incidence rate for herd immunity, 70%, multiply that by the 1% case fatality rate, and got 100,000. So that wasn't a very complicated modeling exercise, I think. I don't want to second guess public health at all. I'm just saying I expected a bit more nuance to be presented, but I gather this was an opportunity to communicate to the public, not necessarily to communicate to scientists.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I want to go back to the first thing you mentioned
Okay.
about the curve and kind of showing, I guess, the date at what you're saying is it would be kind of like the date at which this all could have started to go down. Is that what you mean? Or I just
Sort
want to
of, yeah. I mean,
clear.
with the understanding that, of course, the data is dirty and all of this is in flux all the time. But other countries like Iceland has an excellent model. They presented transparently on their national website. Gates Foundation has their IHME model, which has been done for every state in the USA. And I think President Trump's presentation was based on that modeling. And they have given an expectation for when the peak cases and the peak deaths should occur in each state. And that's useful. It's useful for planning purposes. It's useful for communicating to the public about what they should expect and how long they should expect it for. And I understand you don't want to give away, too much false hope or get pinned down to a given date because it will change. But I think at this stage, being as open with the public is the best course of action for people to understand that we're all in this together and this is a moving target and everyone's doing the best that they can. And the citizens are part of this process. If they don't feel as if they're part of the process, they won't cooperate with doing their part.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because I guess a lot of us journalists who were on that call didn't even know to ask for the questions that you would have had, because we're just laymen's like the rest of the people out there who are hearing this kind of information. So that's the big thing that you found was missing. I mean, you talked about this a little bit earlier, how this messaging wasn't really for people like you, wasn't really for scientists. Can you
That's right.
speak to me about who this was for?
This messaging was for the general public and for media, therefore the general public, to understand why we did the things that we did. Some people still don't get why we're locked up in our houses. They think, oh, we're protecting ourselves from the disease. And that's true. But this was an expectation of an overwhelmed healthcare system based upon some scary numbers that were computed by some scary people. And people need to understand that had we done nothing, we could have seen chaos in the hospitals and tragedy across the population. So that's the scary part of the messaging. There's nothing new here, really, for those of us who follow the numbers carefully. I was honestly bracing myself for some new projections that were going to terrify me and have me stay in bed all night weeping. But I didn't see that. I saw pretty much what I've been seeing from the data all along. So in some ways, that was reassuring.
Hmm. Yeah, because basically now what we're looking at is the kind of best case scenario is somewhere between 3,000 and 15,000 deaths when
Yeah.
this is all said and done here in Ontario. Can you explain why we're seeing such a wide
So
margin there?
modeling, you have to understand, is an art as much as it is a science. So when you're attempting to model, well, modeling has two purposes. First is to explain the present, and the second is to make predictions about the future. When you're trying to make predictions about the future, the artistry is in not throwing so much information at the model that it describes the present too much that it's not applicable to the future anymore. We can describe the present perfectly with enough variables, but it takes a certain number and a certain kind of nuance to make it flexible enough to see into the future. And the further into the future you go, the more uncertainty exists. So we have to sort of make allowances for that uncertainty as we progress into the future, hence that wide error bar. I will say that I've been comparing the Canadian case to the Californian case because we have comparably sized populations. And the Gates Foundation models have shown a similar trend that was presented today by the Ontario government for California, and their projected deaths are, I think, 2 to 15,000 as well. So we're in the same ballpark. So this all makes sense given the population sizes and the extent of the interventions put into place. And as noted, even the seasonal flu gives us a couple thousand deaths per year. So this is an order of magnitude more serious than the seasonal flu, even if we do everything right. But that's where we are, right? I mean, any number of things can still happen. We can get really good at this and get those deaths down to a very small number if we all focus and do our part.
Some people were talking about how, because this isn't an exact science and there's so much unknown and it's an art and all of this kind of stuff, that it's not even really beneficial to be out there in the public. Can you speak to me a little bit about the dangers of releasing data like this publicly?
The danger is the imprecision breeds distrust. And this is the danger of being a scientist in general, is you're always going to be a little bit wrong. And my mantra with science is always true until further notice. Because as more information comes in, you redefine your theories. And the hope is that as time and experience track on, we err towards truth as the curve becomes less erratic and more predictable. So the danger is for people who don't understand that this is not a precise thing. This is not astrophysics where we can aim for the asteroid 10 million light years away and get it bang on. This is a situation where the variables change every day. The danger is that people won't trust us as we move forward. But I think there's a greater danger in not being transparent. We live in a strange time of conspiracy theories, distrust of authority, all those things, where our only path forward is complete transparency, even about our vulnerabilities and uncertainties.
Okay. I think that kind of did it for my glaring
Oh,
questions. But as I mentioned before, I don't always even know what the right
right.
questions to ask are. So is there
Well,
anything else that you think I
yeah, I
should?
mean, some of I mean, Dr. Donnelly was so impressive to me in how he communicated, and he said all my favorite words, including testing and serology. And to my mind, the serology test is one of these things that'll get us in large part back to normalcy. And the serology test is the ability to detect for antibodies and therefore to test for who is immune. And once we can do that, well, then we can have a staged return to society. He didn't answer the question about how long we need to be in lockdown. I think the implication that was given from his presentation was that 2 years of lockdown. I don't think that's what the data suggests, actually. I think comparing us to the Gates models for various states and for other kinds of modeling, I think we may be isolated for a couple months, 3 months, maybe 4 months, but it shouldn't be 2 years because we expect, again, a return to society and then a couple more peaks before this thing is done with. So yeah, so my takeaways were I would have liked to see an epi curve, but of course, this is not for me. I like the fact that you talked about testing, particularly serological testing. And I would have liked to have seen more clarity about the projections for how long we expect to be restricted in our movements.
And so when you're looking at, 3 or 4 months, that's from what you've seen in Iceland and the States, I gather, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And based upon early modeling by some epidemiologists back in January, the idea is that the tighter the control over our movements, the less time we need to get that generation of new cases down to a manageable rate. The more lax we are, the longer it takes. So there is a philosophical argument going on right now around the world of how best to deal with this. Do we suppress or do we mitigate? Right now, we're kind of halfway in between the two. If we mitigate, then we have a sort of, a social distancing, but no lockdown, and you always have a steady supply of patients into the ICUs that you keep to a manageable level, but maybe you produce an immune population in 6, 7, 8 months, right? If you suppress, then we lock down hard, we get our case numbers down to something, very small, we return to society, but the disease is still lingering out there and very few of us are immune. So if we take the suppression model, as I think we should, because it gets us back into life faster, then has to be compared with an enormous deployment of public health infrastructure. He talked a bit about the army of new contact tracers that are being trained. That is key. I'm so glad about that. That's the thing that'll get us back to normalcy. That's part of this enormous public health deployment that needs to happen. Testing and contact tracing, so that when the new cases are identified, we can isolate them and quarantine them, so that the rest of society can get about its business more or less normally. So again, the lockdown scenario appears to be how we're going to approach this.
Yeah, because when we talk about testing, especially here in Ontario, we've been criticized greatly for being slow to test and for having backlogs of tests. They
Yeah.
say that the backlog is now cleared. Um, but I mean, should we be substantially more aggressive in testing? That's
Um,
the
we have to
answer.
test strategically, as Dr. Donnelly was saying, and what that means is deploying your testing in such a way to identify those cases where you get the biggest bang for your buck. For example, right now, if we're all isolated, if you have some symptoms and you get tested positive, well, what's the diagnosis? What's the prescription? You stay home. If you don't test positive, what's the prescription? You stay home. It doesn't change anything. It gives information, but it doesn't change anything. On the other hand, if we test someone who's very likely to be spreading, like a daycare worker or a doctor, and they test positive, we know we can lock them down and prevent them from spreading. So testing, in my view, can be viewed through three lenses. The first lens is a clinical lens, which is how most people view it. And the clinical lens tells us that testing is done to identify those with a disease so we know how to treat them. The public health lens, which is what we kind of view it now as we try to control this epidemic, the public health lens tells us that we test to identify those people we need to isolate to prevent for greater spread. And the third lens is the health systems lens. So we test in order to gain information for planning the next stage in this. So how we deploy the testing must be strategic according to those three categories. And the biggest cry from the public is around the clinical lens. I've got these symptoms. How come they won't tell me if I've got the disease or not? It doesn't matter if you've got the disease. The treatment is going to be the same
Right.
mostly until you get to the hospital because you're so serious. Then you'll be tested because then we need to know which treatments to give you. Right. So that's why we're testing the serious cases. As more testing kits become available, we can deploy them with greater alacrity. So Iceland does a fascinating thing. They do their symptomatic testing as we do, but they've also partnered with a private company, I think Decode Genetics, to do random sampling in the population, like random screening. As a result, they have a really good idea of the prevalence of the disease in their population. And I think their estimate is like 0.9%. So that gives them a sense of how close they are to herd immunity. It also gives them a sense of which regions of the country they need to focus more of their resources on, allowing the rest of the country to get back to some sense of normalcy. And they also deploy detectives, actual criminal detectives, to do contact tracing because they take that stuff seriously. Right? So
Mhm.
again, that's the model for intense investment in low technology, accessible interventions, public health infrastructure to get us to normalcy. We don't need the salvation of the vaccine or a cure, though that would be nice. We can do it now with the technologies available.
Okay, great. Well, I think that
Sorry, I
that
lectured you for a half hour there.
That's okay. That's okay. I think no, it was an interesting it's an interesting conversation. I mean, I could probably spend the next hour with you, but
Got stuff to do.
especially given the fact that I'm just recording this on my laptop, I think we'll cut it off there.
All right, cool.
But on it, I really appreciate this. Thank you very much for taking time for us because this is going to help everybody.